Hey, welcome back, my friend. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Wherever you are in the world, whatever kind of day you've had, pull your blanket up a little closer, let the room go soft around you, and come with me, because tonight we're going somewhere very specific and very quiet. We're going to an old English cottage in the heart of winter. Not a grand manor, not a castle with blazing hearths in every room. A real cottage. Small, stone-walled, full of draughts and wood smoke and the particular smell of wet wool drying near a fire. The kind of place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives in the 1790s, navigating cold and darkness with nothing but their own hands, their own knowledge, and the rhythms that had been passed down through generations before them. Tonight we'll follow one woman through those winter days and nights. We'll feel the cold she felt. We'll smell the bread she baked. We'll understand what it actually meant to wash your bedding in February with nothing but freezing well water and cracked, reddened hands. What it meant to take a bath, or more often not take one. What it meant to wake before dawn, when the fire had gone cold and the ice had crept inside the windows, and the whole world outside was just silence and grey. This is not a glamorous story, but I think you'll find it's a rich one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying our time together today, could you take a quick second to subscribe and hit the like button? It truly makes a massive difference and allows us to keep these episodes coming. Also, leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. I genuinely love finding out. So, dim whatever lights you have left. Settle in, and let's go back. Picture a morning in January 1793. The village is somewhere in rural Wiltshire, one of those quiet folds of English countryside where the hills roll gently and the lanes are narrow, and the cottages sit close to the earth as if they are trying to stay warm by pressing themselves flat against it. Snow fell 2 nights ago. Not a great dramatic blizzard, but a quiet, steady, insistent snowfall that layered itself across the fields and hedgerows and stone walls and turned everything pale and still. The woman we're going to spend time with tonight is named Margaret. She is 31 years old, though in the light of a winter's morning she sometimes looks older, her hands in particular. Her husband Thomas works as a day labourer, hired by the larger farms in the area for ploughing, hedging, ditching, whatever the season demands. They have 3 children. The youngest is 4, still prone to sudden illnesses and midnight coughing fits. The oldest is 11 and helps Margaret with nearly everything. Their cottage has 2 rooms, just 2. A lower room that serves as kitchen, living space, dining room and workspace all at once, and an upper sleeping space reached by a ladder rather than proper stairs, because proper stairs would have taken floor space they simply did not have. The walls are stone, thick enough to hold out some of the cold but not all of it. The roof is thatch, which is actually a reasonable insulator when it's dry, but thatch has a complicated relationship with the English winter, and dry is not always how it stays. There is one fireplace. Everything that happens in this cottage, everything that keeps this family warm and fed and alive through January and February, flows from that single fireplace. Margaret is awake before the children this morning, which means she's awake in a darkness so complete it has weight to it. There is no gaslight on these country lanes. There is no candle burning unless she lights one, and candles cost money, so she doesn't light one yet. She knows this room by feel. She knows exactly how many steps it takes to cross from the sleeping area to the top of the ladder, and she descends it in the dark without thinking. The lower room is cold enough that she can see her own breath when she finally strikes the flint and lights a tallow candle. Not a beeswax candle. Beeswax is expensive. Tallow is rendered fat, usually from sheep or cattle, and it smells when it burns, a faint animal smell that she has long since stopped noticing. The candle throws a small, uncertain circle of light. The room beyond it stays dark. The first thing she does, before anything else, is go to the fireplace. Last night she did what her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught before that. She banked the fire. She raked the embers into a central pile, covered them with a thick layer of ash to insulate and slow the burn, and placed a curved iron cover called a curfew over the top to protect the coals from any drafts coming down the chimney in the night. The coals have been sitting like that for 6 or 7 hours. Most mornings they're still alive. Most mornings is not all mornings. She crouches in front of the fireplace and lifts the curfew carefully. The ash beneath it is pale and cold-looking, but when she sets it aside and uses a small pair of bellows to breathe air gently across the pile, a red glow pulses from somewhere underneath, still alive. She exhales with a relief she doesn't entirely consciously feel, because this relief has become so routine that it no longer quite rises to the surface as emotion. It's more like the absence of a bad outcome, which in January is its own kind of grace. She builds the fire back carefully. Small pieces of wood first, the dry stuff she keeps near the hearth specifically for this purpose, then larger pieces as the flame strengthens. The wood she uses comes from their own small stack in the lean-to attached to the back of the cottage. Thomas spent a week in November chopping and stacking, and every time Margaret opens that door to fetch wood, she's aware of how much remains and how long the winter still has ahead of it. This is the arithmetic of winter. Every stick burned is a stick that will not be there in February. By the time the fire is going properly, some warmth has begun to edge into the room. Not enough warmth to be comfortable, not yet, but enough to change the quality of the cold from hostile to merely present. Margaret hangs the iron kettle over the fire on its crane, that hinged arm bolted to the inside wall of the chimney that allows her to swing the kettle out over the hearth or pull it back as needed. She'll need boiling water, she needs it for almost everything. Now. Let's stay right here for a moment in this pre-dawn kitchen of a Wiltshire cottage in 1793, because there is something worth understanding about the cold itself. We use the word cold casually today. We say we're cold when we walk from a heated car to a heated building. We turn a dial and the radiator clicks on. We sleep under duvets filled with synthetic materials specifically engineered to trap heat with extraordinary efficiency. The cold we know is an inconvenience. The cold Margaret knows is a condition she lives inside without escape. The walls of her cottage are thick but not insulated in any modern sense. There is no layer of mineral wool packed between inner and outer surfaces. Stone conducts cold, and by January those walls are cold all the way through. Cold enough that sometimes on particularly bitter mornings there is a film of ice on the interior surface where the stone meets the air. The windows are small, which helps somewhat, but the glass is old and ill-fitting, and the putty around the frames is cracked in places, so the wind finds its way in through gaps that Margaret has stuffed with rags. She stuffs them every autumn. By midwinter the rags have dried and shrunk and new gaps have opened, and the wind makes a thin, persistent sound in the corners of the room that you learn to hear without hearing. The floor is flagstone. Cold rises through flagstone the way heat falls from the ceiling. Margaret keeps a piece of worn woolen matting near the fireplace and nowhere else, because the matting was expensive, and there's not enough of it to cover the whole floor, and the whole floor doesn't need it because people don't stand on the whole floor, they stand near the fire. Her feet, even inside thick wool stockings and leather shoes, are never truly warm in January. This is not a complaint she makes. It is simply the season. The children understand cold the way children who have grown up inside it understand it. They sleep together in the upper space under a pile of blankets and quilts that Margaret has assembled over years, some inherited from her own mother, some pieced together from scraps, Some bought second-hand at the market for a few pence. The pile is thick and heavy, and the children burrow into it at night like small animals going to earth. By morning, the space above their heads is cold enough to see breath, but the space inside the blankets is warm with their shared body heat, and they are reluctant to leave it. Margaret lets them sleep until the fire has been going for half an hour or so, and the lower room has risen from genuinely dangerous cold to merely uncomfortable cold. Then she calls up to them, not harshly, but without the option of being ignored. Her oldest, a girl named Jane, comes down first. Jane knows what needs doing in the morning, and does it without being directed, which at 11 years old is a competence that Margaret quietly relies on more than she ever says. The youngest, little William, needs to be carried down the ladder because he is still half asleep, and the ladder is steep, and she worries. The middle child, a boy of 8 named Robert, comes down on his own and immediately gravitates toward the fire, with the focused intensity of someone who has been cold and is done with it. Morning in a cottage like this is not a slow affair. There is no leisure in it. Every moment of the early hours is spoken for before it happens, allocated to tasks that must be done in a particular order if the rest of the day is going to function. While the kettle comes to a boil, Margaret puts on the porridge. Oatmeal cooked in water, sometimes with a scraping of salt, sometimes with a small amount of milk if the cow that Thomas boards part share with a neighbouring family has produced enough. The porridge cooks in the iron pot that hangs from the same crane as the kettle, swung to a different position over the fire so both can heat at once. Managing the fire as a cooking instrument is a skill that takes years to develop. The ability to read the heat in the coals, to know where the hottest point is and where the gentler heat lives, to swing the crane at the right angle and the right height, to achieve the temperature you need without burning what you're cooking. Margaret does this without thinking about it. It is in her hands the way walking is in her legs. While the porridge cooks, she wraps a shawl more tightly around her shoulders and goes out to deal with what needs dealing with outside. Outside in January is its own world. The snow is still on the ground from the night before last, though it has been walked on now and is greyish at the edges of the path. The sky is barely light. Whatever pale colour January calls morning has just begun to show above the tree line to the east, a thin cold brightness that says the sun is out there somewhere behind the clouds, but has no particular intention of warming anything. Her breath comes out in visible puffs. The cold hits the back of her throat when she breathes through her mouth, and she breathes through her nose instead, which is what you learn to do in January in a Wiltshire lane. She has a small number of chickens kept in a wooden coop at the back of the cottage, built against the stone wall to use its heat on the bitterest nights. She opens the coop, checks that all 6 are alive and reasonably lively, collects the 2 eggs that have been laid overnight, closes the coop again. 2 eggs from 6 hens in January is not bad. Hens lay less in winter because there is less light and because they are spending their energy staying warm rather than making eggs, and this is something Margaret accepts the way she accepts the January sky. She was not made in a season that promised abundance. She also goes to check the water barrel they keep outside, a large wooden barrel that collects rainfall from the roof and provides water for washing and other non-drinking purposes. This morning there is a skin of ice across the top of it, half an inch thick, which she breaks with the handle of a bucket. The water beneath is very cold, the kind of cold that makes your hand ache inside 10 seconds if you leave it submerged. She fills the bucket and carries it inside. The chickens are fed a small amount of grain, the barrel is checked, and she's back inside within 10 minutes. Small tasks, but small tasks done twice a day, every day, through January and February, with fingers that lose feeling quickly and a path that is icy under thin leather soles, add up to something. They add up to the quiet, accumulated cost of winter. Breakfast is porridge, a cup of weak small beer for Margaret and Thomas, milk for the children. Small beer was the common daily drink in England at this time, and for reasons that made complete practical sense. Water from wells and streams was genuinely risky, particularly in areas near farms, where animal waste and human waste both found their way into the same water table eventually. Small beer, brewed from grain with just enough fermentation to kill the bacteria, was safer. It was low in alcohol, not enough to intoxicate, just enough to be safe. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, the elderly drank it. It was simply what you drank with your meals, the same way we drink water today without thinking about it. Thomas leaves for work after breakfast while it's still barely light. He wraps himself in his heaviest coat, a thick wool garment that Margaret has mended so many times in so many places that there is more her stitching in it than original fabric. He wears 2 pairs of wool stockings inside his leather boots, which helps somewhat. He will work outside all day, whatever the weather does, because day labourers in this period worked or they went without pay, and going without pay in January, when the stores are already running low, is not a possibility he entertains. He doesn't complain about the cold. He goes out into it the way Margaret goes to the water barrel, because it's there and it has to be done. This is the thing that I keep returning to when I spend time with this history, not the drama of it, because there isn't much drama, just the dailiness of it. The way every single morning asks the same things of you, and you give them again and again without the option of not giving them, and you build a life inside that requirement. Now let's talk about the cottage itself in more detail, because the physical space shapes everything that happens inside it. The lower room, the main room, is roughly 15 feet by 12 feet, which sounds small until you realise that this is not a room designed around the modern idea of separate functions. It's a room designed around the fire, and everything in it exists in relationship to that fire. The fireplace takes up most of one wall, a wide, deep opening with a stone lintel above it, worn smooth by generations of the same reaching up to hang things that Margaret does every day. Above the fire, from iron hooks and wooden pegs driven into the stone on either side, hang a collection of pots, a kettle, a trivet, a pair of old bellows, a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, a side of salted bacon wrapped in cloth. These are not decorative. These are functional objects in their storage positions, close to the fire, because close to the fire is where the warmth is and where things need to be. Along one wall there is a wooden dresser, dark with age and use, with open shelves above and a cupboard below. On the shelves sit the household's dishes, earthenware mostly, a few pewter plates that came down from Thomas's grandmother, some wooden spoons, a salt box. The salt box hangs near, but not too near the fire, because you want the salt to stay dry, but you also don't want it to absorb smoke. Everything in this room has a precise position worked out by long experience. There is a table, heavy and plain, with 2 benches and 1 chair, the chair being Thomas's because the chair has a back, and backs on chairs were a small comfort that went with the head of the household in this period. Margaret doesn't think about this, it's simply how it is. She stands at the table or sits on a bench. Against the far wall from the fireplace is where the cold is most concentrated, and where you feel most clearly the distance between here and warmth. In summer that corner is fine. In January it's a different country. The butter, if they have butter, is kept on a stone shelf in that corner because butter keeps longer in the cold. Root vegetables are stored there too, in a wooden box half filled with dry earth, because cold and dark and dry earth will keep a turnip alive much longer than warmth will. The far corner of a 1790s cottage is a crude refrigerator, and Margaret uses it exactly that way. The upper sleeping space reached by the ladder is a single room under the sloping thatch roof. The roof's angle is sharp enough that you can only stand fully upright in the centre. The beds, such as they are straw mattresses on wooden frames, covered with the pile of blankets and quilts we already mentioned. There is no furniture up here beyond the beds and a small wooden chest where Sunday clothes are kept. The floor is bare wood. In winter the thatch above does a reasonable job of holding warmth in, which is one of the genuine advantages of thatch over tile or slate as a roofing material. But reasonable is not complete, and on the most bitter nights the upper space gets cold enough to be uncomfortable even under all those blankets. Margaret and Thomas sleep up there together with the children close by, and the shared body heat of 5 people in a small space is not nothing. It is in fact one of the primary heating strategies of a family in a cottage like this. You sleep close, you share warmth, the children pile in between the adults on the worst nights. Privacy, in the modern sense, is not really a value this space can afford. Now I want to tell you about something that I find genuinely fascinating about cold in the 1790s countryside, and it's something that hardly ever gets talked about in popular history. The cold came inside in ways we genuinely can't picture. We think of cold as something you can either shut out or let in, a binary you manage with insulation and heating. For Margaret, cold was a presence inside the cottage as much as outside it. The stone floor was cold, the stone walls were cold, the single-pane windows were cold, and in the mornings they were sometimes furred with frost on the inside. The water in the jug on the dresser could freeze overnight if the fire burned very low. The wet washing, if she'd made the mistake of leaving it too near the window to dry, could be stiff with ice by morning. She dealt with this not by trying to eliminate it, because she couldn't, but by organizing her life around it in ways so habitual they had become invisible. She kept her cloak on indoors on the worst days. She taught the children to keep their feet off the flagstones and on the matting near the fire. She moved the jug of drinking water to the mantelpiece at night so it stayed within the range of the fire's heat. She stuffed the gaps under the door with a long sausage-shaped cloth she'd filled with sand and sawdust, made for exactly this purpose, rolled against the threshold every evening and rolled away every morning. These are not dramatic adaptations. They are the small intelligence of a person who has learnt to live inside a set of conditions she cannot change. Now let's talk about laundry, because laundry in a cottage in January 1793 is one of those things that sounds like a minor domestic detail until you actually understand what it involved, at which point it starts to sound like something else entirely. Margaret does laundry every 2 weeks in winter, less frequently than in summer, because laundry in winter is an ordeal that takes the better part of a day and leaves her with hands so raw and red they ache when she tries to flex them. It requires water, and in winter water means either the barrel outside with its skin of ice in the mornings, or trips to the well at the end of the lane with a yoke across her shoulders and 2 buckets swinging from each end, each bucket holding about 2 gallons and each gallon weighing 8.5 pounds. Do the arithmetic. A full washing day might need 30 gallons of water. 30 gallons means 15 trips to the well with the yoke. Each trip in January along a frozen rutted lane carrying 40 or 50 pounds of water is approximately 50 yards there and 50 yards back, with the weight pulling at her shoulders and her feet finding the most stable footing they can on the ice. She fills the large iron cauldron that stands on its 3 legs over the fire. Filling it completely takes several trips worth of water, and she starts heating it before she's brought all the water in, so the early batches are already warming while she's still fetching. Time is always a calculation in this house. Once the water is hot, she adds lye, which is a powerful alkaline solution made by soaking wood ash in water and draining the liquid through a cloth. Lye is the cleaning agent. It breaks down grease and grime the way modern detergent does, through chemistry, though the people using it in 1793 didn't think of it in those terms. They knew it worked. They'd been making it since before anyone alive could remember. The recipe had been passed down in the same way as everything else, mother to daughter, not written down, just known. Lye is caustic, it is hard on the skin. Even before she plunges her hands into the washing water, Margaret's skin on the backs of her hands and around her knuckles is already dry from the cold and already slightly cracked. The lye water makes this worse. She has a small amount of goose grease she rubs into her hands at the end of washing days, a habit her own mother taught her and her mother's mother before that. The goose grease helps. Not enough, but some. The clothes and linens go into the hot lye water and are agitated with a heavy wooden implement called a dolly or a posser, a long pole with a wooden end shaped roughly like a plunger, which she uses to pound and twist the fabric against itself and against the sides of the cauldron. This is the washing machine. This is the entire mechanical system of laundry in 1793. A woman's arms, a wooden pole, boiling water, and something caustic to break the dirt loose. The items she washes most urgently are the linen shirts and shifts, the stockings, the smaller cloths used in the kitchen. The larger items, the blankets and the heavy outer clothes, get washed less often because washing them requires more water, more fuel, more time, and more physical endurance than the smaller items. A heavy woolen blanket wet through is an extraordinarily awkward thing to handle and rinse and wring and carry outside to hang. In summer this is hard. In winter it is formidable, because here is the thing about winter laundry that I want you to really feel. You wash the blankets, you wring them out with your hands, or with a wooden wringer if you have one, which not everyone does. You carry them outside, and outside is January. You hang them on the hedgerow or the fence or the line strung between two posts, and they hang there in the cold, wet air, and they freeze. They freeze before they dry. By afternoon, the blanket you hung at 9 in the morning is stiff as a board, rigid with ice, which means you bring it back inside and drape it near the fire, where it will take the rest of the afternoon and half the evening to thaw, and then slowly dry, filling the room with the smell of wet wool and steam. Wet wool has a smell. If you've ever been caught in the rain in a heavy wool coat, you know it. That particular lanolin and damp smell that is not unpleasant exactly, but is very present. In a small room with a fire and wet woolen blankets steaming, that smell fills everything. The children's hair smells of it. Margaret's hair smells of it. The food on the table is slightly flavoured by the steam and the smoke. This is the smell of a winter cottage, not the crisp cold outside, not the fresh air people imagine when they think of the countryside. Inside, in January, it is wood smoke and wet wool and the faint tallow smell of the candles, and underneath all of it, the warm animal smell of people who have been living in a small space with a lot of heat and not very much opportunity to wash themselves. Let's talk about bathing, or the thing that passed for bathing in a stone cottage in 1793. Modern people, when they first encounter this subject, tend to have one of two reactions. The first is something like mild horror. The second, which I think is more interesting, is curiosity about how exactly people managed, because they clearly did manage, and they managed in ways that were more thoughtful and more practical than the romantic image of medieval squalor suggests. Margaret does not have a bathtub. She has a large wooden tub, round, coopered like a barrel, that lives in the corner of the lower room when it's not in use, and comes out for bathing, for laundry overflow, for brewing, and for whatever else requires a large quantity of water contained in one place. This tub, filled to a useful depth, requires a very large amount of hot water, and heating very large amounts of water in an iron cauldron over a fire is not a fast or efficient process. A full bath, what we would call a full bath, the kind where you sit in water and wash your whole body, happens in this cottage once a week for the children, and less often than that for the adults. Not because Margaret is indifferent to cleanliness, she is not, but because the logistics of a full bath in January, the water, the fuel, the time, the sheer labour of it, mean that a full bath is an event you plan for, not a daily ritual you maintain. What happens instead, what happens most mornings, is partial washing. In the warm season, this is done at the water barrel outside. In January, it happens at the table near the fire, with a basin of water that Margaret heats to the point where it's warm but not scalding, and a cloth, and soap if she has soap, and the deliberate washing of the face and hands and whatever else can be reached without removing too many layers in the cold air of the room. The soap she uses, when she has it, is a hard yellow soap bought from the chandler in the market town, made from tallow and lye, similar to the lye she uses for laundry. It does the job. It's not gentle on skin. Everything in this domestic life involves some element of roughness on skin. On bathing days, which might happen every fortnight or so in winter, the tub is set in front of the fire and filled with hot water, and each child is bathed in turn, youngest first, because the youngest gets the cleanest water. This practice, bathing children in the same water in order of age, was nearly universal in households of this kind. Clean water was scarce, and fuel for heating it was scarce, and you used what you had. By the time the eldest child is bathed, the water is grey and cooling. Margaret herself washes after the children, and she does so quickly and practically, because standing in cooling grey water in a room that is warm near the fire, but cold everywhere else, is not comfortable, and prolonged bathing is a luxury this space cannot afford. Thomas bathes separately when he can, usually on a Saturday evening, in water heated fresh for him as the head of the household. This is not vanity, it is the same logic by which he has the chair. Hierarchy in a cottage like this is not always about power in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it's just about the order things get done in. Her hair. This is something I want to spend a moment with, because hair care in 1793 without running water or shampoo or heated styling tools is a world entirely unto itself, and it is one that most people have no framework for whatsoever. Margaret has long hair, dark brown going slightly grey at the temples, and she wears it up every day in a way that takes her less than 3 minutes, because she has done it for 15 years, and her hands know the shape without her mind having to instruct them. It is braided and pinned, or twisted and tied with a piece of cloth, practical and neat. She washes her hair rarely, every 3 or 4 weeks in winter, more often in summer. This sounds alarming to modern ears. The scalp produces natural oils, called sebum, and when you wash your hair with strong alkaline soap and hot water, you strip those oils away, which is why modern hair needs conditioner and why modern people who wash their hair every day feel greasy quickly if they skip a day. The reason for that feeling is partly that the scalp has been trained to overproduce oil to compensate for constant stripping. Margaret's scalp has not been trained this way. Her hair, washed rarely and maintained with a bone comb and the occasional application of a small amount of goose grease or butter to the ends, is long and reasonably healthy and far less unpleasant than you might expect because it has found its own equilibrium. She combs her hair every night before bed. This is the ritual, the 100 strokes with the bone comb, or something approaching that, not counted precisely, but done until the hair is smooth and tangle-free. She braids it loosely for sleeping, and in the morning it comes out and goes back up in its practical arrangement. This is a routine so embedded in her evenings that the act of picking up the comb, the specific weight of it in her hand, and the particular texture of working it through her hair is one of the things that signals to her body that the day is ending. Even in a life without clocks set by electricity, the body learns its rhythms from repeated cues. And now I want to take you through a washing day more carefully, because I think it's the thing that most clearly illustrates the physical reality of winter in a cottage of this kind, the sheer labour of maintaining a household without machinery or running water or any of the systems we use to make this invisible to ourselves. A washing day is planned in advance because it requires conditions to cooperate. You need a day when the fire will be free for most of the morning, which means you arrange your cooking around it. You need water, which means the barrel outside needs to be reasonably full, or you make the well trips the day before to fill every vessel in the house. You need weather that is cold, but not so viciously cold that the clothes will freeze solid before they dry at all, because frozen solid and never dried is worse than not washed at all. Margaret gets up even earlier than usual on washing days, sometimes before first light in the dead of winter, and begins heating water while the fire is still building back up from its banked state. The cauldron goes over the fire immediately. Kettles go next to the fire directly on the stone, to heat separately. She is calculating backwards from when she needs things done. The children's shifts, the small linen shirts they wear closest to the skin, go in first because linen washes more easily than wool, and they are the most urgently in need of cleaning, worn every day against skin. Then the stockings, which in a family of 5 go through a remarkable rate of wear and must be washed and dried and put back on within the same day or thereabouts, because there are not enough pairs to leave any out of use for too long. Then the kitchen cloths, the rags used for a dozen purposes in the cooking and cleaning of a cottage. The heavy things come later, the wool blankets, if they're due for washing, which they might be once in the winter season and not more. They are so much more labour that they get their own half day. Wringing is the thing that breaks hands. You take the washed item from the hot lye water and you wring it between your hands, twisting and compressing to drive the water out, and then you put it in a separate basin of clear cold water to rinse, and you wring it again, and then you put it to dry. The rinsing water needs to be changed multiple times because lye residue in fabric is hard on skin. Margaret rinses until the water stays relatively clear, which takes patience. Her hands by the end of a full washing day are red to the wrist, deeply red, the red of inflammation, and her knuckles are cracked in 2 or 3 places where the skin has simply given way under the combination of cold and lye and repeated immersion and wringing. This is not dramatic. She doesn't react to it. She rubs in the goose grease and goes to bed, and in the morning her hands ache, but they function. They always function. They have to. Now let's move through the middle of a winter day, because there is so much that happens in the hours between morning chores and evening fire that I don't want to skip over it. Midday in January is the peak of light, which in England in January means a pale, cool, fairly low-angled light that gives you perhaps 6 or 7 hours of anything you could genuinely call daylight. The sun in January in England barely climbs above the horizon before beginning its descent again. By 3 in the afternoon the light is already failing. By 4 it is essentially dark. This is the tyranny of January days. Not the cold, which is manageable with the right habits, the light, the shortness of it, the way everything that requires seeing properly, sewing, reading if you can read, which not everyone can, mending, writing, has to be done within those few central hours, or done by candlelight, which is expensive and which gives you just enough light to manage and not enough light to do fine work comfortably. Margaret is literate, which in rural England in the 1790s was not universal, but was not rare either. The church schools in many parishes had been teaching reading for several decades by this point, and Margaret had attended one as a girl. She cannot write much beyond her own name and a few necessary words, but she can read a chapbook, or a broadside, or a letter from her sister in Bristol. Whether she has time to read on an ordinary day in winter is a different question. An ordinary winter day looks something like this. After the morning fire and breakfast and the outdoor chores, there is food preparation to consider for the midday meal. This is often soup, which is practical because it can simmer on the fire without constant attention, freeing Margaret for other tasks while it cooks. The soup is made from whatever is in the house: root vegetables from the corner store, a bone saved from an earlier meal, barley or peas if there are any, water. English cottage soup of the 1790s is often thick enough to call a stew, and it is filling in the way that foods made primarily from starchy root vegetables and slow-cooked grain are filling, which is to say deeply, warmly, heavily filling. She tends the fire while the soup cooks. Tending the fire in a cottage of this kind is not a passive thing. It requires attention and judgment throughout the day. How large should the fire be right now? Large enough to cook the soup and warm the room, but not so large that it consumes wood faster than necessary. The fire is a managed resource, not an extravagance. Every stick of wood that goes on it is a calculation. There is mending. There is almost always mending. In a household where clothing is not cheap and not easily replaced and is worn every single day through hard physical work, things wear out and fray and tear and split at the seams with a regularity that creates a continuous stream of small repairs. Margaret's sewing basket, a round wicker thing with a lid, contains needles in different sizes, a thimble, a spool of linen thread and a spool of wool thread, a small knife for cutting, and several pieces of fabric in various stages of usefulness, some large enough for patches, some too small for anything but rags. She mends stockings by darning them, which is a technique worth understanding because it's one of those skills that was once universal and is now essentially lost. A darn is not a patch. It is a tiny woven repair made by weaving new threads across and through the hole in a grid pattern until the hole is filled with a small new piece of fabric that is part of the original material and part of the new thread. Done well, a darn is nearly invisible. Done by someone who has been darning since childhood, a darn can last longer than the original knit. Jane is learning to darn. Margaret has been teaching her for 2 years, and Jane's darns are visible still, slightly lumpy, slightly uneven, the marks of hands that know the theory but haven't yet accumulated the unconscious precision that comes from 10,000 repetitions, but they hold, they do the job. And Jane, sitting across from her mother on the bench near the fire, with her mending on her lap, is learning something that will serve her for the rest of her life in ways that are entirely practical and not romantic at all. Robert at 8 is less useful in these indoor tasks, though Margaret sets him to fetching wood and keeping the wood basket filled, a job that suits him because it requires going outside, which he always prefers. He makes a nuisance of himself letting cold air in every time he opens the back door, and Margaret tells him to do it quickly and keep it shut, and he does it quickly and keeps it shut for 20 minutes before opening it again. Little William at 4 is too young for useful work, but old enough to be in the way of useful work, which Margaret manages with a patience built up through the same repetition as darning. She gives him small tasks, carrying a potato from the corner to the fire, stirring something with a wooden spoon under supervision, and these tasks are not strictly necessary, but they make him feel included, and they keep him out of the things that are dangerous, which in a room with an open fire and a cauldron of boiling water is an active concern. Fire was the great domestic danger in cottage life of this period, not just for warmth and cooking, but for everything, and a room full of fire and fabric and small children required a constant low-level attention that Margaret maintains without naming it as such. She simply knows where everyone is. She simply knows when a child has gotten too close to the hearth. She simply knows when the fire has reached the point where the pot hanging over it might scorch rather than simmer. This knowledge lives in her body, not in her head. Let me talk about what people ate in a cottage like this in winter, because it's one of those things that history often reduces to a simple narrative of hardship, when the reality is more interesting than that. By 1793, the diet of a working-class English family in the countryside had a particular character that was shaped by the agricultural season, by what was available, and by the long tradition of making preserved food stretch through winter. Bread was the foundation, and the bread baked in a cottage like this was not white bread. White bread was for people with money. The bread Margaret bakes is a darker, denser thing made from a mix of wheat and rye or barley, coarse milled flour that makes a loaf with more texture and more flavour than white bread, and more nutrition too, though no one in 1793 thought about it in those terms. Bread is baked at the beginning of the week and lasts through it. The oven Margaret uses is a clay and brick bread oven built into the side of the fireplace, which requires its own ritual to use. You heat it by building a small fire inside it. Let the fire burn down to coals, rake out the coals, test the temperature by throwing a handful of flour in and watching how quickly it browns, then slide the loaves in and seal the opening with a wooden door. The retained heat of the brick cooks the bread without continued fire. It sounds simple. It requires exactly the same kind of learned judgment as everything else in this kitchen. Root vegetables are the winter staples: turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, potatoes. Potatoes had arrived in English cottage gardens fairly recently by the 1790s, having come from the Americas via Ireland and gradually moved across the English countryside over the course of the 18th century, and by 1793 they were common in cottage plots and increasingly part of the ordinary diet. They keep well through winter in cool, dry storage, and they are filling and versatile, which in a cottage kitchen is almost everything. Salt pork, if they have it, is the main protein of the winter diet. Salt pork in this context means pieces of pig, usually the fatty cuts, that were slaughtered in the autumn and preserved in salt and stored in a brine barrel in the corner, and can be retrieved throughout the winter as needed. The pig that was alive and eating scraps in the back garden in September is now sustaining the family through January and February, cut into pieces and brought out as needed, rinsed of salt and cooked in the soup or fried in its own fat over the fire. There is nothing wasted. The fat from cooking goes into a small crock on the mantelpiece and is used as cooking fat, as a wood treatment for boots, as a hand cream in emergencies. Eggs, when the hens lay, provide additional protein, though in January this is unreliable. Dried peas and beans, stored from summer, go into soups and are cooked down into thick, filling, warm things that stick to the ribs in exactly the way winter requires. Thomas sometimes brings home a rabbit if someone on the farm he's working that week has set snares and shares the catch. Margaret knows how to skin and joint a rabbit in under 5 minutes, a skill she learnt from her mother and has never once thought of as remarkable, because it is not remarkable to her. It is just one of the practical competencies a woman in her position is expected to have. Cheese, when they have it, is eaten with bread. Butter in winter is spread thinly and without waste, because it is not made in great quantities in winter, when the shared cow's production slows. There is nothing wrong with this food. It is not glamorous, but it is sufficient, which in January is the correct ambition. Now let's talk about light, because what happens to a cottage in January when the sky fails at 3:30 in the afternoon is one of the things that most completely separates this life from ours. When the light goes, you have the fire and you have candles, and both of these are managed resources. Margaret makes some of their own candles in autumn from tallow, following the same process we talked about in the example scripts, dipping and dipping until the layer is thick enough, 30 to 40 dips for a usable candle. She also buys some from the chandler, the cheaper tallow variety, because no household in her position can make enough of its own to last the winter. A single tallow candle gives roughly the same light as a single watt of modern electrical illumination. 1 watt. Your reading lamp is probably 60 watts. The light in your kitchen is probably 100. Margaret's kitchen in the evening is the fire plus 1 candle, 2 if something requires close attention, and the art of the evening is arranging yourself near enough to the sources of light and warmth to do what you need to do. The fire is the better source of light, not just heat. A good coal fire in a wide hearth gives a warm, amber, dancing light that can illuminate a room of this size reasonably well, particularly near the fire itself. The corners are dark, the far wall is dark, the upper reaches of the room are dark, but by the fire, with the candle, you can sew, you can darn, you can read a passage or two from a chapbook or a Bible if you have one. Margaret has a Bible. It was her mother's, and before that her grandmother's, and the cover is separated from the binding and has been tied back on with a piece of string. She doesn't read it every night, but she reads from it on Sundays, and occasionally on weekday evenings if the children have been settled early, and Thomas is quiet and the day has left her with enough of herself remaining to want something other than sleep. The evenings in a cottage like this in January are not long. The day has used her thoroughly. By 7 or 8 o'clock, when the children are in bed and Thomas has eaten and is sitting quietly near the fire with his clay pipe, Margaret is often simply done. Not tired in the soft yawning way of modern evenings, done in the way that physical labour done all day in the cold produces, a bone-deep tiredness that doesn't have much interest in entertainment or conversation, that wants only warmth and horizontal and sleep. Before she sleeps there are small things to do. The fire must be banked, the coals raked together, the ash piled on, the curfew placed, the candles must be snuffed, the door must be checked, the chickens, if she hasn't done it at dusk, must be confirmed secure. These are not optional. They are the last line of the day's responsibilities, and she does them with the automatic completeness of someone for whom routines are not decorative but structural. She goes up the ladder. Thomas comes after her. The children are already asleep, their breathing audible in the small space. She pulls the blankets up, pulling a particularly thick one that was made by her grandmother, a heavy wool quilt, up to her chin, and the cold that was present everywhere in the room closes in around the blankets, and she is inside the warm space they make, and she is asleep within minutes. This is not insomnia country, this is exhaustion country. Now let me tell you about the specific texture of cold that penetrates a stone cottage at night, because I think it's one of those things that people imagine without quite imagining correctly. The fire is banked. The room is no longer being actively heated. The retained warmth in the stone walls and the stone floor will dissipate through the night as the stones conduct it outward to the cold air surrounding the cottage. By 3 in the morning on a genuinely cold night, the lower room of this cottage can be cold enough that a glass of water left on the table would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The sleeping space above is slightly better because the thatch roof retains some warmth, but the thatch is also where the drafts live, the small gaps where the bundles of reed don't quite meet, where the wind in the night finds its way through and creates cold air movement in the space above the bed. Margaret knows these drafts the way you know the sounds of your own house, automatically in her sleep. She pulls the blankets tighter when she feels one. She has been doing this her whole life. On the very worst nights, when a hard frost is expected, she will sometimes bring the children down to sleep near the banked fire, or add extra wood to the fire before bed to keep it burning higher through the first part of the night. This uses more wood but is sometimes necessary, particularly for little William, who is prone to chest ailments in the cold, and has had 2 winters already where his cough turned frightening before it turned better. There is a particular cold that children get when they sleep in a cold room, that manifests first as a red cold nose, and then as a cough, and then sometimes as something worse, and every mother in a cottage like this in 1793 knows this progression, and manages it as best she can, with extra blankets and staying near the fire, and the kinds of simple remedies that have been passed down for generations. A hot drink made from dried elderberries, a piece of cloth warmed by the fire and pressed to the chest, a few drops of something from the apothecary if the illness progresses, and if there's money for the apothecary, which is not always the case. The apothecary in the nearest market town is 3 miles away. 3 miles in January on icy lanes there and back is a significant undertaking for a woman by herself or with a sick child. The apothecary's remedies are not expensive precisely, but they're not free, and for a family living on a labourer's wage in 1793, every expenditure is weighed against every other. A shilling for a medicine means a shilling less for food or candles or the other accumulated small necessities of a winter household. So Margaret's medicine cabinet, such as it is mostly made of things she has prepared herself or gathered from the hedgerows and her own small garden over the year. Dried chamomile for the stomach, dried elderberry for the chest and the fever, a root of valerian, which she has had since she doesn't remember when, used sparingly because she doesn't know when she can get more, a small bottle of turpentine given to her by Thomas's mother years ago, used as a chest rub for bad coughs, a piece of sulphur that she burns in the room when illness threatens to spread through the family, a practice that has a long tradition behind it and some genuine antimicrobial basis, though she doesn't know this and wouldn't call it that. She has a knowledge of local plants and their uses that she absorbed as a child from her own mother and from the women around her, the herbalist wisdom of an older tradition that in 1793 was beginning to compete with and be displaced by the more systematized practice of the trained apothecary and the physician, but which in a cottage 3 miles from the nearest market town was still the first resource available when someone fell ill. This knowledge isn't mysticism. It's accumulated observation, passed down through generations, with a mixture of things that genuinely work and things that don't, and the wisdom to tell the difference is not always reliable, but the practice of tending the ill is always careful and always present. Let me tell you about February, because I think February in a Wiltshire cottage in 1793 is the hardest month. January has the brightness of the new year, the sense of having come through Christmas and still having winter ahead of you but also behind you. March has the earliest hints of spring, the snowdrops and the changing of the light that signals things are turning. February has neither of these. February is the deep middle of winter, when the stored food from autumn is genuinely running low, when the woodpile is noticeably diminished, when the cold has been constant for long enough that it has settled into the walls and the floors and the body itself, and shows no particular sign of intention to leave. Thomas's work in February is often thinner, because there is less that can be done on frozen ground, and some farmers let their day labourers go temporarily, rather than pay them for days when the ground can't be worked. This means wages reduced or gone altogether for stretches of days at a time, and the household accounting that Margaret performs constantly in her head, the what do we have and what do we need and what order do we spend it in, becomes more urgent. The parish had a system of poor relief in this period, the old poor law, which varied by parish in its administration, but generally provided some assistance to families in genuine distress, a small cash payment, a quantity of bread, sometimes coal, not generous, not always reliable, but present. Margaret and Thomas are not yet in need of parish relief, and they are not certain they want to be, because accepting parish relief came with a particular social status in a village community, a status of having been publicly identified as unable to manage, and that status, even if unwarranted, was something careful people tried to avoid. So February is the month when everything is measured twice before being used, when the porridge is made a little thinner in the mornings, when the soup at midday gets a little more water and a little less substance, when the fire at night is kept a little lower than is comfortable, when the candles are used more sparingly and the evenings spent in a darker room than Margaret would choose if she had the choice. It is also, strangely, the month when the community shows itself most clearly, because in a village of 40 or 50 households, everyone knows roughly how everyone else is doing, and in February there is a kind of quiet circulation of resources that doesn't have an official name, but functions as a social system. A neighbour with a better stocked root cellar leaves a sack of turnips at the door. Thomas's employer on a good week gives him an extra piece of salt pork as part of his wages, which is not legally required, but is a common practice. Margaret's sister in Bristol sends a small parcel with tea and some dried fruit that she's saved since Christmas specifically for this purpose. The women on the lane share what they have, a bit of good fat for candles, a piece of flannel for a sick child's chest, the knowledge that this particular hedge has sheltered rose hips that can be made into a vitamin-rich tea. This circulation of small resources is not charity exactly, not in the way we use that word. It is more like a mutual understanding that in February everyone is managing, and the managing goes better when no one manages entirely alone. Now let me tell you about the village itself, because Margaret doesn't live in isolation even though the cottage is small and the winter is long. The village is a cluster of 20-odd cottages around a green with a church at one end and a blacksmith at the other, and a small shop that also serves as the local alehouse, which means on winter evenings there is somewhere for the men to sit near a fire that someone else keeps, which is not nothing. Thomas goes there perhaps once a week, on a Friday evening, not to drink to excess but to be in company, to hear what's happening on the other farms, to play a game of cards or dominoes, to sit in a room with other men and speak and be spoken to, which is a need that is not less real in 1793 than it is now. Margaret's social life is different and more diffuse. It happens in the moments of contact woven through the ordinary week, at the well, where women meet when they're fetching water and exchange a few words, at the market when she goes, which in winter is once a fortnight rather than every week, at church on Sundays, where the sermon is often long, but the company before and after it is genuine and warm. The women of the village know each other's circumstances with an intimacy that comes from years of proximity and shared difficulty. They know who is struggling this winter and who is managing better. They know which children are coughing and which husbands have been kind and which haven't been. They know who is pregnant again and what the winter is doing to her, and they bring food and company and practical assistance without being asked, because being asked in this community is not always possible, and being offered is what neighbours do. There is a woman named Anne who lives 2 cottages down from Margaret, a widow of 60-something who has been in the village longer than anyone except the very oldest, and who knows more about managing a cottage through a hard winter than anyone else on the lane. Anne is the one Margaret goes to when William's cough turns worse and she's not sure it's just a cough. Anne is the one who keeps a particular mixture of dried herbs in a jar on her dresser that she learnt from her own mother and gives out sparingly because some things are limited even when you want to be generous. Anne is the one who says to Margaret in February, in the particular calm, direct way that older women in this kind of community often speak, "You look tired, come and have some tea." And Margaret sits in Anne's kitchen, which is warm in the same way her own kitchen is warm, because they are built the same way and managed the same way and have the same fire in the same kind of fireplace, and she drinks tea from Anne's good cup, and she is warm and not alone for half an hour. This is not small. In February this is not small at all. I want to talk about what Sunday meant in a cottage like this, because Sunday had a character that weekdays didn't, a rhythm that was different and that served a purpose beyond the religious. Sunday is the day without field work, without paid labour, the day that belongs to the household itself. In the Church of England parish that Margaret and Thomas attend, the Sunday service is a fixture, attended by almost everyone in the village, from the wealthiest farmer in his enclosed pew near the front to the poorest labourer standing at the back or in the gallery. The church is unheated. Church heating, in any but the grandest churches, is not yet general in 1793. The congregation sits in coats and shawls and breathes visible clouds, and the vicar's sermon is heard from behind clouds of breath, and the hymns are sung quickly, partly because of genuine piety, and partly because if you open your mouth to sustain a long note, you lose a great deal of body heat very quickly. But the service is not the only thing Sunday is. Before the service there is the particular business of dressing in Sunday clothes, and in a household like this that has meaning. The children's Sunday clothes are kept in the chest in the sleeping space, brought out once a week, worn for church and then put away again to preserve them from daily wear. Jane's Sunday dress is a dark green wool that was made by Margaret 3 years ago and has been let out twice at the seams as Jane has grown. It's not new, it's not fashionable in any urban sense, but it's whole and clean and pressed, and putting it on is a different thing from putting on weekday things. After church there is the midday Sunday meal, which is the best meal of the week. If there is a joint of something, a piece of salt pork, or occasionally a small piece of mutton from the butcher in the market town, it goes on the fire on Sunday, potatoes roasted in the coals alongside, a pudding if there's flour and eggs and enough of everything else. This is the meal that the week builds toward, not in the sense that everyone is thinking about it all week, but in the sense that it's the meal at which the full family is together at the table without the urgency of work pressing everyone forward, and where the food is slightly more abundant and slightly more careful than on a weekday. Thomas says grace before Sunday dinner, a longer grace than on weekdays, said properly with everyone's heads bowed and hands still, because Sunday asks a different kind of attention than Tuesday, and both Thomas and Margaret maintain that distinction carefully. Now let me take you into an aspect of this life that very few histories talk about, which is the sound of a winter cottage at night. We think of the countryside as quiet, and in some senses it is. There is no traffic noise. There are no voices from television sets or music from other people's headphones or the particular ambient hum of modern electrical infrastructure. The quietness of the countryside in 1793 is real, and it is deep, but a stone cottage at night in January is not silent. The wind, when there is wind, which in January there is often wind, makes sounds in the walls and the thatch that are not frightening once you've grown up inside them, but that are present and various. The thatch rustles. The gaps in the window frames create a thin sound when the wind hits them at the right angle. Not a whistle exactly, but something between a whistle and a sigh that changes with the direction and strength of the wind. The wooden beams overhead, the ones that support the thatch, settle and creak as the temperature changes through the night, because wood contracts in cold and expands in warmth, and the change from evening fire to banked coals changes the temperature of everything. The fire itself, even banked, makes small sounds, the settling of coals, the occasional pop of gas escaping, the very faint sound of the wind coming down the chimney and meeting the ash-covered coals. These sounds are the sound of the house breathing, and you learn them without trying, and they become the background of sleep. And when they change, you notice the change before you're entirely awake. Animals, there are always animals. The chickens in the coop occasionally stir, a shuffle and a settle, nothing alarming. If there's a cat in the house, which many cottages kept for the practical purpose of keeping the mice down, the cat moves through the rooms at night in that particular soft, purposeful way of cats who know the house by dark as well as by light. Mice in the walls, which there always are regardless of the cat's best efforts, make their own particular sound, a small scratching and scurrying that you become entirely accustomed to and that no longer registers as disturbance. And outside, especially on still cold nights with a clear sky, there are owls. The barn owl that hunts the fields around the village has a call that is not the hooting you might expect, but a long rasping shriek, and if you are not used to it, it sounds alarming. Margaret has heard barn owls since childhood and sleeps through them without stirring. The children do too, mostly. William sometimes wakes and calls out, and she is up the ladder before she's fully conscious, her hands on him before her mind has caught up, feeling for fever, reassuring, the automatic responses of a mother in the dark. Let me talk about what happened when someone in this household got seriously ill in winter, because this is one of those places where the distance between then and now is sharpest and most important to understand. Medicine in a Wiltshire village in 1793 was in a period of transition. The trained physician, the doctor with a university education and a set of systematized treatments, existed but was not affordable for a family like Margaret's, and not always available even when affordable, given the distances involved. The apothecary in the market town was more accessible and less expensive, trained to a practical rather than theoretical standard, dispensing medicines from his shop that included both effective preparations and completely ineffective ones, because 1793 is a period when chemistry is beginning to understand what actually works, but the understanding is not yet complete. For most ordinary illness, the family manages itself. For the things that can't be managed, the choice is between the apothecary 3 miles away and whatever wisdom lives in the village. The village has Anne, who we've met, and there is also an older woman named Mrs. Colby, who lives a mile out of the village on the farm road, and who is known as a healer, not in any supernatural sense, but in the practical sense of being someone who has accumulated over 60 years of living a very detailed knowledge of what different plants and preparations do to the human body, and who people go to when things are beyond Anne's knowledge and when 3 miles to the apothecary is too far. Mrs. Colby charges nothing. She takes whatever you bring her as thanks, a bundle of kindling, a piece of bacon, a pat of butter. The economy she operates in is not money, it is reciprocity, the same reciprocity that governs the rest of village life in hard weather. If something goes genuinely wrong, if an illness is beyond what the village can manage, if a birth is complicated, if an injury is serious, then the physician must be fetched from the market town, which means sending someone on horseback, which means someone has a horse, which means someone with a horse has to be willing and available, and then the physician comes if he will, and charges what he will, and is paid if there is money, and given credit if there isn't, and the outcome is whatever the outcome is. In 1793, the great killers of children are measles, whooping cough, smallpox, and the various forms of what people called fever, which encompasses everything from typhoid to influenza to scarlet fever. Smallpox vaccination has been available in England since Edward Jenner's work in 1796, but in 1793, the year we're living in for this story, it is not yet available. Jenner has been observing and working but hasn't published yet. The village children are vulnerable to smallpox in the way all unvaccinated children in this period are vulnerable. And Margaret knows this the way everyone knows it, as a constant background possibility she doesn't think about, because thinking about it constantly would make daily life impossible, but that is always there. Both of her boys have had measles, survived it, and carry the immunity. Jane somehow missed it in the epidemic 3 years ago, and Margaret watches her more carefully during winter, which is when the illness circulates. She cannot explain her watchfulness in any systematic way, she just watches. Let me come back to a question about warmth, specifically about warmth in bed, which is where the real system of staying alive in a cottage in January gets concentrated. The bed in 1793 is not just a place to sleep. It is the primary technology of warmth in a household that can't afford to heat its whole house all night. The fire is banked, the room is cold. The bed is where all the retained warmth of 5 human bodies is concentrated under a heavy pile of wool, and that concentration of warmth is the thing that makes January survivable. The blankets and quilts on the family beds in a cottage like this are accumulated rather than purchased all at once. There is the heavy wool quilt that came from Margaret's grandmother, dark from age and still dense and warm. There are 2 wool blankets in reasonable condition, mended in places. There is a thinner quilt made from scraps of various fabrics that Margaret pieced together the winter before last when William was ill and she was up nights anyway and needed something to do with her hands. There is the oldest blanket, so darned and patched that it is essentially a different object from its original self, which goes on the children's bed. The beds are made on the warmth principle, not the aesthetic principle. Feather mattresses were the luxury standard in this period, and the grandest cottages might have one. But Margaret's mattresses are filled with straw, which compresses over time and must be restuffed periodically, and with wool fleece where she can get it. The straw mattress is not as warm as feather, but it is warm enough, particularly under the pile of blankets, and it does the job of keeping the sleeper above the cold wooden slats of the bed frame. There is a practice of warming the bed before getting into it. A bed warmer, which is a long-handled copper or brass pan with a lid that you fill with hot coals from the fire and run between the sheets before getting in, is an item owned by some households in this period and not others. Margaret doesn't own one. What she does instead is warm a piece of stone at the fire and wrap it in a piece of cloth and tuck it into the foot of the bed before the children go up. The warmth doesn't last all night, but it lasts long enough to take the edge off the cold sheets. And that edge, the first contact with cold linen on cold skin, is the hardest moment. Once you're inside the blankets and the sheets have warmed from your body, the bed is genuinely warm and genuinely comfortable, and you sleep. This is something people in this period say, not complaining about their beds. The beds are warm. The beds are the warmest place. The beds are what you look forward to in January, the genuine warmth of a pile of wool blankets shared with people who love you, the warmth that no other place in the cottage can match. It is a warmth that requires no fuel to maintain, that is produced entirely by human bodies and retained by human ingenuity in the form of wool cloth and careful stacking, and it is real and substantial and sufficient. I find something quietly beautiful in that. Now let me go deeper into the social world of the cottage in winter, because I don't want to leave you with only the physical description, the tasks and the cold and the management of resources. The life inside these walls is not only physical, it has texture, warmth, meaning. Thomas and Margaret have been married for 12 years. They are not a romantic story in the dramatic literary sense. They are 2 people who have built a practical life together and who care for each other in the particular way that people who share 12 years of difficulty care for each other, specifically in the knowledge of each other's habits, in the anticipation of each other's needs, in the quiet accommodation of each other's moods. Thomas is a man of few words, which in 12 years of marriage Margaret has learnt to read the way you read any language you've been immersed in long enough. His quietness after a hard day in the cold is different from his quietness after an argument with a neighbouring farmer, and she knows the difference without being told. She sets his supper down and leaves him in peace after the first kind, and after the second kind she says something light and small to open the door, which he may walk through or may not, and either way is fine. He does not, in general, help with the domestic work. This is not because he is unkind, but because in the world they both inhabit the division is clear. He works for wages outside, she works without wages inside, and this division is as natural and unquestioned to both of them as the shape of the furniture. He does bring in the wood. He does kill the pig in autumn and butcher it. He does fix things that break, the fence around the chicken coop, the hinge on the back door that came off in November, and that he mended with a piece of leather and 3 nails on a Sunday afternoon. He does these things without being asked because they fall on his side of an invisible but shared line. He is, in the terms of this place and time, a decent husband. He doesn't drink beyond what's social. He doesn't raise his hand. He comes home when he says he will. He hands over his wages on Friday evening and lets Margaret manage them, which she does with a precision that he couldn't match and doesn't try to. His gentleness with the children is not demonstrative, not the kind of gentleness that announces itself. But Jane knows to go to him when she has a particular kind of question, the ones about the wider world beyond the lane, the ones about how things work outside the cottage. And Robert knows that on Sunday afternoons, when the work is done and the dinner is over, his father will sometimes take him to walk the edges of the farm fields and show him things, the way a mole has pushed up its winter hill, the way a fox has left its track in the snow, the way the ice on the pond has formed in a particular pattern. These walks are not instructional in any formal sense. They are the wordless transmission of a man's knowledge of the land to his son. And little William, at 4, has not yet been assigned to either of these relationships particularly. He is still in that stage of early childhood where he belongs to everyone equally and clings to Margaret most. He reaches for her hand when he's uncertain, and she gives it without looking, and this is the entirety of his emotional need met in that moment. Let me talk about the animals, because in a cottage life like this, animals are not peripheral. They're woven into the economy and the daily rhythm in ways that matter. The chickens we've mentioned, 6 hens, producing eggs through the year and more or less stopping in the darkest winter months, which is a fact of biology Margaret has accepted. She feeds them grain scraps and kitchen leavings, and they eat them and they lay eggs, and the eggs are eaten, and this is the cycle of a small domestic flock in a cottage garden. There is also the cat, a grey and white tom of indeterminate age and large practical confidence, who entered the cottage 3 years ago through the back door and never left. Margaret did not name him. The children call him Greycoat. His function is the mice, and he performs it with the dedication of an animal who understands his position in the household economy. He brings mice and occasionally voles to the back step as tribute or announcement, and Margaret steps over them in the morning and disposes of them and considers it fair exchange. He sleeps by the fire in the evenings in the position closest to the hearth that the humans have left unclaimed, and he sleeps in the upper room at night where his body heat adds a small but not negligible amount to the warmth of the blanket pile. The pig, when there is one, lives in the back garden in a small wooden pen through spring and summer and into autumn, eating kitchen scraps and whatever else comes its way, and then in November, which is the traditional slaughter month, Thomas kills it with a practiced efficiency that is neither cruel nor gentle, but simply purposeful. Margaret prepares the parts. The salted pork goes into the brine barrel, the fat is rendered, the intestines become sausage casings. The blood, if she's going to make black pudding, goes into the pot immediately because blood doesn't wait. Every part of the pig is used. This is not philosophy. This is the practical intelligence of a household that cannot afford waste. The partial share in the dairy cow is a more distant arrangement, managed through Thomas's connection to the farm that boards her. They receive a portion of milk a few times a week, sometimes more in spring and summer when the cow is producing well, less in winter. The milk is used fresh when possible, made into butter occasionally, into a simple fresh cheese sometimes. Nothing is wasted. Let me now talk about something that happened in February 1793 that I think illustrates this life in a way that a general description cannot quite capture, a specific ordinary incident that contains everything we've been talking about. It began with the thatch. A section of the roof, on the eastern side of the cottage, had been thinning for 2 winters. Thatch, the reed or straw used to roof English cottages for centuries, is a skilled and durable roofing material, but it is not permanent. A good thatch lasts 20 to 40 years, but a good thatch requires skilled maintenance and periodic replacement of the worn sections, and the section on the eastern side of Margaret's cottage had been thinning for longer than it should have been because the thatching cost money and they'd put off addressing it. One night in mid-February, a particularly hard night with wind from the northeast, the section gave way. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the way that old thatch fails, a loosening and thinning that finally allowed a section of reed to lift in the wind and expose a gap in the roof through which the wind came directly into the sleeping space. Margaret woke to cold that was different from ordinary cold, cold moving, cold directed. She lay in the dark for a moment, identifying it. The gap was above and slightly to the right of where William slept, and she was up before she'd finished the thought, feeling in the dark for William, who was deeply asleep and cold on the exposed side, and she moved him without waking him fully into the center of the bed between herself and Thomas, and pulled the old patched blanket up over the gap in the pile and lay back down. In the morning she told Thomas before he left for work, and he looked at the gap from inside and from outside, and he knew what it meant and what it would cost, and he went to work. She spent that day managing a cottage that had a hole in its roof in February. The gap was not large, perhaps a hand's breadth, but wind came through it with intention, and in a small sleeping space a hand's breadth of wind in February is significant. She stuffed the gap from the inside with a piece of straw and a rag, which helped but didn't solve it. She reorganized where the children slept, moving them all to the far side of the bed away from the gap, which meant a rearrangement of the blanket pile to compensate for the changed distribution of warmth. She went to Anne. Anne knew a thatching family in the next village, a son who did the work his father had done before him. Anne sent word through her own network of contacts, which was faster and more reliable than any formal message system in this landscape, and by Thursday the young thatcher was on Margaret's roof with a bundle of new reed, and the gap was filled by midday. He charged 6p, which was not a trivial sum but was manageable, just, and was worth every penny of it, because the alternative was a roof that leaked cold all winter, and that would likely get worse before it got better. This is how things work in this community. The problem happens. Someone knows someone who knows how to fix it. Word moves through the lane. The solution arrives. It's not seamless and it's not without cost, but it functions, because in a village of this kind, the mutual aid is structural rather than optional. Now let me tell you about the light coming back. Because there is a point in February, not a day you can name exactly, but a collection of days, when you begin to notice that the evenings are not quite as early as they were, not by much, not enough to dramatically change what you can do by daylight, but the change is perceptible to someone who has been noticing the light every day for months, measuring it the way Margaret measures the wood pile, with a constant awareness of what's there and what's going. By the end of February, the sun is setting a full half-hour later than it was at the solstice. This doesn't sound like much unless you've been managing your entire day around the available light, in which case half an hour is substantial. Half an hour more to sew before the candles need lighting. Half an hour more of the children being active without needing firelight to see by. Half an hour more of the sky being something other than dark. The birds notice before the people do. By late February the song thrushes in the hedgerows have started again, the bright repeated phrases of the thrush's song that are one of the clearest signs that the land is beginning to turn. The snowdrops are up in the churchyard, white and precise, impossibly delicate looking for something that pushes through frozen ground. The days are still cold, often very cold. There will be another frost or 6 before spring is anywhere near complete, but the direction has changed. Margaret feels the direction change. She doesn't announce it or mark it in any ceremonial way. She simply feels it, the way you feel the shift of a tide if you've been watching the water long enough. She starts to think about the garden. Not yet, not in a practical way. There is nothing to do in the garden in late February, but she starts to think about it, what she'll plant when it's time, whether the peas she saved from last summer are still viable, whether she has enough seed potatoes, whether the soil in the corner where the beans go will need more rotting leaves dug in before it's ready. These thoughts are not concrete plans. They are more like the mind beginning to look forward, beginning to project beyond the immediate circle of fire and food and warmth that has been the whole radius of planning for 3 months. There is something important here that I want to name because it speaks to something about this life that I think is easy to miss. Margaret is not depressed by winter. She is not surviving it in the way the word surviving sometimes implies, gritting her teeth until it's over. She is living in it, fully, in all its difficulty, without the option of finding it otherwise than it is, and there is a completeness to that, a kind of presence in the difficulty that comes from not having any alternative to it, that I find oddly moving. The cold is cold, the labour is labour, the nights are long and the food is limited, and the woodpile goes down, and the children's coughs worry her, and the roof fails in February. All of this is true, and also, the fire in the evening is genuinely beautiful, amber and alive, the most beautiful thing in the room, the thing everyone moves toward without discussion. The soup she makes from the root vegetables and the bone stock and the barley is genuinely good. The warmth of the bed with Thomas beside her and the children's breathing audible in the small space is genuine warmth, the best kind, earned and shared. The half hour with Anne's good cup of tea is genuinely pleasurable. Jane's darns are getting better. Little William said something funny this morning that she's still turning over in her mind hours later, smiling at it. The life is hard and the life is good. These are not opposites in a cottage in January 1793. They are the same thing. Now I want to take you through a bath day in more detail, because I've mentioned it, but I want you to really feel it. A bath day in this household is planned approximately the way Margaret plans a washing day, in advance, with the conditions lined up, the water thought about, the fuel thought about, the timing thought about. It happens for the children on a Sunday, in the week interval or so between full baths. It happens for Margaret and Thomas less often in winter, because their baths require more water and more heat and more time, and the logistics are simply harder to fit in when the days are short. The tub comes out of the corner where it lives, and is positioned as close to the fire as it can safely go. This puts it maybe 3 feet from the hearth, which means the side facing the fire is warm and the side facing the rest of the room is cool, and you shift in the water to distribute the warmth the way you distribute everything in a cottage, by constant minor adjustment. The water has to be heated in the cauldron and carried over to the tub, 1 kettle and 1 potload at a time, mixed with some cold water to bring it to a usable temperature, which Margaret tests with her wrist, the way she tests everything she can't otherwise measure. She gets the tub about half full, which takes several cauldron loads and the better part of an hour. The children go in order from youngest to oldest, soap applied with a cloth and rinsed off, hair dunked briefly if it needs washing, dried off with a rough linen cloth in front of the fire. The younger children do not love this process. William particularly objects to having his hair washed, an objection that he makes known at volume, and that Margaret moves through with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this before and will do it again, and knows it takes approximately as long as it takes. Jane, at 11, manages her own bathing with minimal oversight. Robert is somewhere in between, willing in principle and resistant in practice. When the children are done, the water is not clean, but it is still warm, and Margaret uses it to wash her own feet and hands and face and whatever she can reach efficiently in the time before it cools too much. In summer she would use fresh water. In February the logistics of heating fresh water just for her are more than the moment calls for. This is not deprivation to her. It is the logic of the situation, managed the way everything else in her life is managed, with the intelligence of long practice and the acceptance of conditions that are what they are. She washes her hair on these bath days if it's been long enough since the last time, bending over the basin of remaining warm water and working the soap through with her hands, then rinsing with clean cold water from the pitcher, which is the worst moment, the cold water on a wet scalp in a room that is warm near the fire but not warm everywhere, and she moves quickly through it and wraps her head in a cloth and sits near the fire, and the heat from the coals dries her hair through the afternoon. She combs it when it's dry, working through any tangles with the bone comb, and puts it back up in its usual arrangement, clean and tidy and done. The whole process, from setting up the tub to putting it back in the corner and mopping up the spilled water on the flagstones, has taken 3 hours. 3 hours for what we do in 20 minutes, with no thought or effort. This is the arithmetic of domestic life in 1793. Let me tell you about something that I think gets overlooked when people think about winter in old cottages, which is the relationship between isolation and community in the same life. The cottage is small. The family is always present to each other. There is no room you go to when you want to be alone, no door you close between yourself and others, no privacy in any strong sense. This can be claustrophobic, and in long January weeks when the weather keeps everyone inside for days at a time, it sometimes is. Margaret has learnt to find her solitude in time rather than in space, in the early morning before the children wake, in the half hour after Thomas has gone to work, and before she starts the day's cooking. These are not long stretches of time, they are enough. And then outside the cottage, the community is also always present. The lane, the well, the church, Anne's kitchen. These are the places where connection happens, where you are seen and spoken to, and situated in a larger world. In winter the village closes down somewhat, is more self-contained than in the warmer months when people travel more, and there is more coming and going. But it doesn't close entirely. The lane has traffic even in snow. People still go to the well, still nod at each other, still exchange a few words in passing. There is a particular quality to friendship in a village like this in winter that I find genuinely interesting. It is not the friendship of shared leisure, of choosing to spend time together because it's pleasant. It is the friendship of shared condition, of being in the same difficulty together, of knowing that the person you are talking to understands your situation from the inside, because it is also her situation. Anne's kindness to Margaret is not the kindness of someone who has never been cold and is sorry you are. It is the kindness of someone who has been cold and knows that it passes, and knows that company helps it pass. This is a different quality of kindness. It is more practical and I think more real. Now let me take you deeper into the question of what it meant to be a woman in this situation. Not in the grand political sense, though that matters too and we should acknowledge it. In the daily, specific, physical sense of being Margaret in February 1793. She has no legal identity separate from Thomas's. This is not something she thinks about on a daily basis, but it is the structure within which her life exists. She cannot own property. She cannot make contracts. She cannot appear in court independently. She is, in the language of the law at this time, the same thing that the medieval law called covered, subsumed under her husband's legal identity. In practice, in the daily life of a cottage on a lane in Wiltshire, this abstract legal situation shows up in particular ways. Thomas's name is on whatever tenancy agreement exists for the cottage. Thomas is the one who deals with the landlord's agent when the rent is due, though Margaret is the one who has set aside the rent money over the course of the month, and counted it, and knows to the penny whether they have it. Thomas is the one who signs his mark on the labour agreements that govern his working terms, though Margaret is often the one who knows the terms more precisely. She manages the household money. This is not unusual. In working-class households of this period in England, it was common and practical for the wife to control the household expenditure because she was the one who knew what it needed, who went to the market, who dealt with the butcher and the chandler and the baker. The money moved through her hands in its weekly circulation. Thomas's wages handed over on Friday, the market expenditure on Saturday, the rent set aside, the rest calculated against the week's anticipated needs. She is not consulted on his work decisions. He does not inform her in advance when he's accepted a particular engagement or turned one down. These are his decisions to make, and she receives the outcomes of them, as when he tells her on a Thursday evening that the farm at Rowden Meadow has offered him a full week's work starting Monday, which is good news, or when he tells her that the expected work at Ashton has been delayed because the ground is too frozen to plough, which is not good news, and which changes the week's arithmetic. She does not resent this exactly, because resentment requires an alternative to compare it to, and the alternative is not visible from where she stands. What she has instead is competence, the absolute mastery of her own domain, the domestic space and the domestic economy, which in the daily reality of this household is the domain that actually keeps everyone alive. Thomas earns the money, Margaret makes the money work. There is a kind of authority in that mastery that is real if unofficial. When something in the household needs deciding, she decides it, because she is the one who knows which provisions to lay in and which to defer, whether the children need new shoes now or can wait until spring, how to manage the month when Thomas's wages are short. These decisions are hers not because anyone has granted them to her, but because she is the one with the knowledge to make them. This is not equality in any modern sense, but it is not powerlessness either. Let me tell you about March now, and the particular quality of hope that March brings to a household that has been managing since November. March in Wiltshire brings light before anything else. The equinox arrives, and suddenly the evenings are 12 hours long again. 12 hours of daylight instead of the 7 or 8 of midwinter, and this has an effect on everything. The fire doesn't need to come on quite as early, the candles can wait a little longer. The food preparation, which is always timed around light, has a larger window. The children can play outside without Margaret worrying about where the light is going before they've come back in. The ground begins to think about thawing in March, which is a gradual and unreliable process in English soil. You can have a week of clear, mild March days that softens the top layer of earth and puts ideas in your head about spring, and then a late frost in the second week that kills the snowdrops and freezes everything solid again and requires you to readjust. March is not spring yet. March is the possibility of spring, which is a different thing. But the possibility is real, and the possibility changes something in the body that has been managing winter since November, a kind of loosening, a kind of forward-looking. The stores that have been measured out since Christmas begin to seem finite in a different way, not because you're running out, but because running out is no longer the unthinkable prospect it was in January. Spring is coming, and spring means new food. Margaret starts her seedlings in March, in a shallow wooden tray kept on the sill of the south-facing window where it gets the most light. Onion seeds, cabbage, some herbs, whatever she's been saving from the previous year's garden, and whatever she can get from the market or trade with neighbours. The seeds are small, and she plants them with the same careful intentionality she brings to every task that requires precision, pressing each one to the right depth in the tray of soil she's made from a mix of the garden earth and the well-composted kitchen scraps that have been going into a corner of the garden all winter. The tray on the windowsill is one of the earliest signs of spring in the cottage, and the children look at it every morning the way they look at the fire in winter, checking, assessing, interested. Now let me come back to where we started, to Margaret in the pre-dawn cold of a January morning, crouching at the banked fire with her bellows, finding the ember, because I've been thinking about the right way to close this evening, and I keep coming back to that image. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's not. Because it's so ordinary, and so specific and so real. A woman in her 30s in a cold stone cottage in Wiltshire in 1793, before it's properly light, doing what needs to be done, finding the fire that was left for her by last night's self, breathing it back to life with practiced hands. The ember is still there. It's almost always still there, if you've banked it properly and the night hasn't been too long or too cold. She knows this. She knows the probability the way she knows everything about this cottage, from having done it hundreds of times, from the accumulated knowledge of her hands and her senses, from the intelligence that isn't written down anywhere but lives in the body of someone who has been managing this fire since she was old enough to be trusted with it. She blows gently. The ember pulses. She adds a small piece of kindling, carefully, not blocking the air. The flame catches. The day begins. This is not a small thing. In a cottage in January in 1793, the fire beginning is the day beginning, is the warmth beginning, is breakfast and hot water, and the whole structure of the hours ahead. She has done it again. She does it every morning. She will do it tomorrow. And there is something in the doing of it, in the repetition that is not monotony but competence, in the ritual that is not empty but full, in the daily proof that last night's care was enough and this morning's morning is possible, that I find genuinely moving when I sit with it. These were real women. Their names were not recorded in the histories that schools teach. Their knowledge was not written down. Their labour was not counted. But they were here, managing fire and cold and illness and food and children and laundering wool in February water, and the life they maintained in stone cottages in winter lanes was a real life, fully inhabited, specific and skilled and present. I think about that when the wind comes up at night and there's a draught somewhere I haven't found yet, and the house makes its sounds. I think about Anne with her jars of dried herbs and her good cup of tea. I think about Jane learning to darn and getting better at it. I think about Thomas's coat with more of Margaret's stitching in it than original cloth. I think about the ember that was always almost certainly still there if you banked it right. And I think about the warmth of a bed in January, the specific, particular warmth of being inside heavy wool blankets in a cold room with people who love you and whose breathing you can hear in the dark, and how that warmth required nothing electrical, nothing engineered, nothing more sophisticated than 5 human bodies, and the ingenuity of generations of women who knew how to keep a family warm through winter with what was available. That warmth was real. It was enough, and on the best nights it was more than enough. Now let me walk you back through the day one more time, more slowly, through all the hours we haven't fully rested in yet, because there is more in this life than we've touched, and I want to sit with it a little longer before I let the evening go. Morning, as we've established, is managed. By 9 o'clock on a working weekday, Thomas is gone. The fire is properly built, breakfast is eaten, the basic outdoor tasks are done, and the day is beginning in earnest. Margaret's days do not have what we would call free time. Every hour has something it's allocated to, either explicitly or by the logic of what needs doing. but the tasks vary in their nature and their demands, and some of them are things she does not mind, and some of them she actively likes. She likes making bread. This is one of those admissions that appears in the diaries and letters of women of this period, with enough frequency to suggest it was genuinely common. A particular satisfaction in the making of bread, in the mixing of the dough and the feel of it under the hands, and the way it changes as you work it, from a shaggy, resistant mass to something smoother and more elastic that has a particular spring to it when it's ready, a particular feel under the fingers that you learn to recognize after you've made bread enough times that your hands know it without your mind directing them. Bread day is twice a week, and on bread day Margaret is in a particular relationship with the morning that's different from the rest of the week. The fire has to be right, the oven heated just so, the timing worked out so that the bread goes in when the oven is ready and comes out when it's done. She's made bread hundreds of times. The process is not a mystery to her, but there is a precision to it that she respects, a set of conditions that must be met for the thing to come out right, and meeting those conditions has a satisfying quality to it, the satisfaction of skill exercised correctly. When the bread comes out right, which it almost always does, there is a moment when the loaf is sitting on the board cooling and the smell fills the room, the specific warm yeasty smell of new bread, and that smell is as good as anything that happens in this cottage in January. She cuts a small piece when it's cool enough, and gives a piece to each child if they're home, because this is bread she's made today, and there's a generosity possible with today's bread that doesn't apply to yesterday's. She likes the walk to the well on the days when it's not too cold and she's not carrying too much. 3 minutes each way on the lane, past the neighbours' gates and the frozen ditch and the elm tree that stands at the corner, and that she has walked past so many times she has a relationship with it, in the way you can have a relationship with a tree that marks a corner you pass every day. The well is where she sometimes meets Anne or one of the other women on the lane, and the brief conversation at the well is a kind of sociality that doesn't require sitting down or making tea, that happens in the course of the necessary errand, and therefore costs nothing beyond the time it takes to exchange a few sentences. She is interested in the other families on the lane, in the specific way you are interested in people whose lives are adjacent to yours, and whose difficulties mirror yours, with slight variations. She knows that the family in the furthest cottage, the Jacksons, have a harder winter than anyone else because Edward Jackson was sick through November and couldn't work, and they came into the cold months already short of stores. She sends Jane over with a portion of a soup on a Tuesday, when she has made enough to spare, not as charity announced, but as a matter of course, the soup in a covered pot left at the door, with Jane told to leave it and come back. She is interested in what's happening in the wider world, though her access to it is limited. She can read, as we've established, and she reads the broadsides when she can get them, single-sheet printed papers sold at markets that carry news of the events of the kingdom, Parliament, the wars, the prices of grain in the towns. The war with France has been going on, in various configurations, for most of her adult life, and it matters to her not in the abstract but in the specific. It affects the price of things she buys. It affects whether Thomas can find work. It affects whether the parish has money for poor relief, or whether that money has been drawn off for the military. She is not political in any formal sense, but she is not ignorant either. She sometimes talks with Thomas about these things in the evenings, the few words he'll give to a topic that he doesn't have strong opinions about, or much language for. He works with men from various farms and sometimes brings home the talk of the labour market, who is hiring and who is not, what the farmers are saying about the harvest prospects, what the enclosure talk is about in the parish meetings that he sometimes attends, as a token of the labouring community's presence. These conversations are not long or detailed, but they are present, which means the wider world is present in this kitchen, even if only briefly and imprecisely. Let me talk about what happens on a very cold night, the coldest nights, when the temperature drops far enough that the cold becomes something you have to actively manage rather than merely accommodate. These nights happen in January and sometimes in February, and they announce themselves in advance through the quality of the afternoon, when the air has a particular crystalline stillness to it, when the sky clears after days of cloud and the stars come out bright and very numerous, when the temperature drops quickly and early as the sun goes down. These are the signs. Margaret reads them the way farmers read weather, from long habit and accumulated observation. On these nights she takes extra precautions. The fire is built higher before bed than usual and banked more thickly, with a greater depth of ash over the coals to slow the burn and extend the heat through more of the night. Extra blankets come down from the chest in the sleeping space, the ones in reserve for exactly these occasions. The water jug moves from the windowsill to the mantelpiece so it's within the fire's warmth and won't freeze. The children all come into the same area of the sleeping space, close together, and Margaret shifts the blanket arrangement to accommodate this. She checks the chicken coop before she comes in for the night on these very cold evenings, going out with a lantern in one hand and closing the coop door against any gap she finds. Chickens can die of cold if their coop isn't secure, and in January a dead chicken is not just a sadness, it's a loss of future eggs and future meat that is a real economic cost. The back door is checked, the window rags checked, the straw stuffed into gaps anywhere the wind has found a new way in through the old walls. These are not dramatic measures. They are the small intelligence of a household that knows what a very cold night costs if it's not respected. And then she goes up to bed, and she is warm, and the night passes as it always passes when you've done what can be done and given over what you can't control. She wakes once, usually in the middle of these very cold nights, the same middle of the night waking that people in this period experience naturally as part of their sleep cycle. The first sleep and the watch, and the second sleep pattern that was normal for centuries before the industrial era imposed its single consolidated block of sleep. In that wakeful middle-of-the-night space, which might last half an hour or an hour, she lies in the dark and listens. She listens for the sounds that would mean something needs attention. A child who's coughing badly, the chickens disturbed by something, the particular sound of ice on the window that means the temperature has dropped further than expected. Most of the time she hears nothing that needs responding to. She lies in the warmth of the bed and thinks, in the loose, uncollected way that middle-of-the-night thinking works, not about anything specific, not planning, not worrying in any focused way, just the mind moving through its contents in the permission of darkness and warmth and quiet. Sometimes she prays in this space, not formally, not the structured prayers she says in church, a simpler communication, the kind you have with someone you trust enough to be informal with. She says what she means without decorating it. Keep the children well. Let Thomas have work this week. Let the cold not be too long. These are not petitions for miracles. They are the sharing of concern with something she believes is listening, which in a life that contains as much difficulty as hers does in February is not an unreasonable thing to want. Then she falls back into the second sleep, which is often deeper and more satisfying than the first, and she wakes to a morning that is cold but navigable, the ember still there, the fire rebuilding, another day beginning its particular demands. This cycle, every night and every morning, for weeks and months, constitutes a life, not an event, not a story with a beginning and a climax and a resolution, a life, continuous, specific, alive in its details and in its relationships and in the accumulated competence of the woman at its center. I want to spend some time now on something I haven't talked about yet, which is what happened in the cottage when Margaret was pregnant, because she has been pregnant 3 times and has managed those pregnancies in this same space with these same resources, and that experience is part of the fabric of this life in ways that shape everything else. Her pregnancies all happened in different seasons, which means different challenges. Jane was born in late summer, which was relatively favourable. Robert was born in January, which was not. Little William was born in March, which is to say in the transition between the hardest winter and the very beginning of relief, which perhaps explains something about his constitution. A winter pregnancy in a cottage in 1793 is a particular set of conditions. The cold that is already hard on an ordinary body is harder on a body that is also growing a child, using its resources in 2 directions at once. The extra warmth that pregnancy creates internally, the raised metabolic rate that makes pregnant women often run warmer than usual, is welcome in January. The need for more food, the particular food that a pregnancy requires, is less easy to meet when the stores are limited. Margaret managed Robert's winter pregnancy by eating what she could, resting when she could, and asking less of herself in the daily tasks than she would have otherwise. This is not a phrase that comes naturally to her, and it is not easy to do in a household where there is always more to be done than there are hours. Thomas's mother came for the last few weeks of that pregnancy and took over some of the cooking and the heavier laundry, and Margaret accepted this help without making it into a statement, because accepting help is a skill in this community as much as offering it. The birth itself was attended by a midwife from the village, a woman of great practical skill who had attended more than 40 births in the parish, and who was calm and competent and not given to alarmism, which is exactly what you want in a midwife. Anne was there too, because Anne was always there for births on the lane, part of the invisible network of female support that surrounded these events. Margaret doesn't have extensive words for what the birth was like. The words she uses, when she speaks of it at all, are the words women in her community use. Hard work, over now, he came well. The meaning underneath these words is evident to anyone who has given birth or been present for a birth. The brevity is not lack of feeling. It's the same compression of experience that the rest of her speech reflects. The lying-in period after birth, the weeks when a new mother was expected to rest and recover, was observed in this household to a limited extent. She rested for a week, with Thomas's mother handling the cottage. Then she was up again because she had to be, because a cottage doesn't run itself, and a week is what the situation allowed. This was not unusual, this was common. The expectation of a month-long lying-in was for households with more hands and more resources, and Margaret's household was not that. She nursed Robert through that winter and into spring, which was also cold, and which required more food than she always had. She is pragmatic about her body's requirements, in a way that is neither self-sacrifice nor self-importance. The body needs what it needs, and you give it what you can, and you manage the gap with whatever practical intelligence you have. Now let me take you through the kitchen in more detail, because I've been moving through it for hours, and I want to give you a proper picture of it. The range of cooking implements in a cottage of this period is small but specific. There is the iron cauldron, three-legged heavy, the primary vessel for everything from soup to laundry. There is a smaller iron pot for more delicate cooking, or for when the cauldron is in use for something else. There is the Dutch oven we mentioned, a covered cast iron pot that creates its own oven environment in the coals, used for baking when the clay bread oven isn't available, or for things that need a more enclosed heat. There are trivets, the three-legged iron stands that sit in the coals and hold pots or pans at a fixed height above the heat. There is the long-handled iron spoon, and the ladle and the spatula and the tongs, all stored on hooks beside the fireplace. The peel, a long-handled flat wooden spatula, slides bread and pies in and out of the clay oven. The poker and the rake manage the coals. The bellows blow air when it's needed. The crane swings the hanging pots in and out over the fire with an ease that belies how heavy those pots are. Everything iron in this kitchen was made to last for generations, and some of it has. The cauldron that Margaret uses every day may have been her mother's, purchased at a time she doesn't know, and maintained by regular cleaning and drying, and the occasional reseasoning with fat rubbed into the surface over the fire, which keeps the iron from rusting and creates the non-stick surface of a well-maintained cast iron vessel. This is knowledge Margaret doesn't think of as technical, but which is precisely technical, the maintenance of iron cookware by the correct use of heat and fat and drying. Everything wooden in the kitchen is lighter and more temporary. Wooden spoons wear out and are replaced. Wooden boards crack and are patched or discarded. The tubs and barrels that hold water and brine have to be monitored for leaks and repaired with wooden wedges and linseed oil when the staves separate in the dry winter air. The herbs that hang from the hooks above the fireplace are dried from her own garden in summer, gathered and tied in bundles and hung to dry in the warmth above the fire, where they last through the winter in good enough condition to be useful. Sage and rosemary and thyme and marjoram and chamomile and the dried elderberry clusters that become her winter remedy tea. These are not decorative. They smell of the garden and of the summer they came from, which in January is its own kind of comfort. Salt is kept in the box on the wall, covered to keep it dry because damp salt doesn't work properly, and is used with care because it is not free. The salt box has a position that is inherited from the household before her, and she doesn't question it because it works, close enough to the fire to stay dry, far enough not to be affected by the smoke. Vinegar in a stoneware bottle on the shelf, used for preserving, for cleaning, for the occasional medicinal application. It is made at home from the leftover cider apples in autumn, the apple vinegar that is one of the more useful and easily produced preservatives available in a household of this kind. Fat in the crock on the mantelpiece, the rendered cooking fat from pork or whatever else has produced drippings, used as cooking fat when butter isn't available, used as a skin treatment in emergencies, used to oil the leather of Thomas's boots, used to oil the wooden implements when they start to dry out. Fat is versatile and precious and wasted in nothing. The bread crock where the loaves sit after baking, covered with a cloth to keep them from drying out too fast. Bread in 1793 without any preservatives will last 3 or 4 days before it's too stale to eat with pleasure, but too stale for fresh eating doesn't mean too stale for anything, and stale bread goes into soups and into the cooked pottage that is often the midday meal on the days when the bread is old. Let me talk now about what Jane knows. Jane at 11 is not a child in the developmental sense that we use the word today, meaning someone whose primary work is education and play. She is a person in transition between childhood and the full adult responsibilities she will carry within a few years, and the transition is managed primarily by working alongside Margaret in the tasks of the cottage, learning through participation what cannot be taught through instruction alone. Jane can light the fire from the banked coals. She has done it on the mornings when Margaret was ill, when little William was sick in the night, and Margaret had been up half of it, and Thomas was already gone, and the fire had to be rebuilt, and Jane did it without being asked, because she'd watched it done every morning of her life and the knowledge was in her. She doesn't do it as efficiently as Margaret yet. She uses a little more kindling than necessary, but she does it. Jane can make porridge, and can judge when it's cooked enough, which is a judgment about texture rather than time. She can make the simplest soup, the water and root vegetable and salt version that is the baseline from which everything else is built. She's learning bread, which is more complex, but she knows the shape of the process even if her hands aren't sure of it yet. She can do laundry, all of it except the heaviest, and she can hang and collect and fold. She can tend younger children, meaning William, with a patience that is less automatic than Margaret's, but more present than Robert's. She has the beginning of a practical medicine, the knowledge of which dried herb goes in which preparation, absorbed from watching Margaret and Anne over the years. She can darn. She can sew a simple seam. She can hem a skirt and set in a patch. She cannot yet do the more complex work of making a garment from cloth, but she will learn this from Margaret in the next few years, and by the time she's a young woman she'll be able to make most of the simple garments a household requires. Jane also reads better than her mother, because she attended the parish school for 3 more years than Margaret did, and was taught by a teacher who took reading more seriously than the one Margaret had. She reads to the family on Sunday evenings sometimes, from the Bible or from a chapbook of tales that she found at the market stall last summer, and that she's read through several times. Her reading aloud has a particular quality, careful and clear, and slightly too aware of itself. The reading of someone who has not yet fully absorbed text into fluent spoken voice, but still very good, good enough that the family listens without fidgeting. Thomas doesn't read. He never attended school beyond the briefest exposure, and it didn't take. He is not ashamed of this, and not particularly interested in changing it. He knows his world through his hands and his eyes and the spoken word, and this has been sufficient for the life he leads. He sometimes asks Jane to read him a particular passage of something, and she reads it to him with the same careful clarity, and this exchange between them has a warmth to it that is one of the things Margaret observes quietly and is glad about. Now I want to slow all the way down and spend some time in the evening hours of a winter's day, because the evenings are where the day arrives at itself, and where the household becomes most fully itself, when the work is mostly done, and the fire is banked lower, and the candle or the fire's glow is what lights the space, and the 5 of them are together in a way that the divided day doesn't always allow. This is where we started in some ways, with the image of people gathered around a fire in a small room, and it's where I want to return, because I think it's the most important image in this whole evening. The fire in the evenings, lower now, burning through the larger pieces of wood that will take it through the last hours, throws a warm amber light that makes the room look different from how it looks in daylight. The walls seem closer, the ceiling seems lower. The faces around the fire are lit in that particular soft, flattering way that firelight creates, warm on one side and in shadow on the other. It is genuinely beautiful. Thomas sits in his chair with his clay pipe, if he has tobacco, which is not always. The tobacco he smokes is cheap, coarse stuff, nothing like the pipe tobacco of more prosperous men. But it does what tobacco does. It occupies the hands and the mouth and contributes to the quality of thinking that happens when one is at rest and not required to be anywhere. He says little. He is not a man who fills silence for the sake of it. Margaret is always doing something, even in the evenings, because the evenings are the time for the work that requires hands but not heavy labour, the mending and darning and knitting that constitute the continuous maintenance of the household's textile goods. Her hands are never idle when she's sitting. This is not anxiety or inability to rest. It is the deeply habitual working of someone for whom occupied hands are simply the natural state. She can listen and talk and be present to the family while her hands do a darn that has become automatic. She can hear what Jane is reading without losing her place in the mending. Jane reads or sews, sometimes both in alternation, the book propped on her knee and the mending put down when she picks it up, and picked up again when she puts it down. She is developing the same capacity her mother has for attending to two things at once, the useful multi-tracking of someone who has learnt that single-focus attention is a luxury that not every moment allows. Robert, at 8, is usually asleep by the time the evening settles into its quietest state. He goes up the ladder early, protesting sometimes but sleeping quickly, and by 9 or so his breathing is audible from above in the way that children's breathing is, deeply and completely asleep in the way adults rarely are. William, at 4, has an uncertain relationship with bedtime that Margaret navigates with patient consistency. He comes up to the fire, he is brought back to the sleeping space, he comes back down again. This happens 2 or 3 times before something shifts and he stays up and sleeps in the warmth of the kitchen for an hour before Margaret carries him up. This is not a battle that gets won definitively on any particular night. It is the ongoing negotiation of a small child with the concept of night. On the evenings when things are quiet and the children are settled and the fire is good, Margaret and Thomas sometimes talk, not about large things, not usually, about the week ahead, about how much wood is left and what the weather looks like, about Jane's mending and Robert's attitude at church last Sunday, and whether William's cough sounds different from yesterday or the same, about the neighbour's fence that went down in the last frost, and whether Thomas will have time to help fix it Saturday if the work at Rowden Meadow goes well, about small, specific, real things. Occasionally, on a good evening, they talk about other things, about the years before the children, which seem very far away, but which they both remember specifically enough to speak of in the particular detail that shared memory allows. The summer they met at the harvest fair in the village where her family lived, 15 miles from here, which is a distance that felt much larger then than it seems now. The way he brought her a piece of gingerbread from the stall, and she ate it while they walked along the lane, and that was the whole of the courtship, compressed into that first hour, because in a world where opportunities are limited you act on what's in front of you. They laugh sometimes, in the evenings, not elaborately, not loudly. The small quiet laugh of people who know each other well enough that very little explanation is required, who can communicate a piece of shared understanding in a look and know it's received. This is its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of years and difficulty shared, of two people who have built their life together out of what was available and who know the weight of every piece of it. Now let me walk you through the closing of the day. By 10 o'clock on most winter evenings, the household is winding towards sleep. The children are in the sleeping space. Thomas has put out his pipe and is quiet in his chair, which means he's done with the day. Margaret does her final round of the house, the round that closes the day the way the morning's round opens it. The fire is checked. The coals are raked together in the particular way she's done it since she was old enough to be trusted with fire. The ash is piled over carefully, the right depth. Not so thick it smothers the coals too completely, not so thin it doesn't insulate them enough. The curfew goes over the top, positioned just so, a gesture so practiced it takes 10 seconds and uses no conscious thought. The candle is snuffed. This is done carefully because the wick, extinguished too abruptly, can flare briefly and send a spark into the room, and a spark in a room full of cloth and thatch is not acceptable. She pinches the wick between wet fingers, or uses a candle snuffer if she has one, which she sometimes does and sometimes doesn't, and the light goes out, and the room is left with only the faint amber of the banked fire showing through the ash. The door is checked, the bolt engaged, the window rags, the ones stuffed into the worst gaps, are checked by feel in the dark to make sure they're holding. The water jug is moved to the mantelpiece. The fire screen, if there is one, is placed in front of the fireplace to catch any sparks that might spit in the night. She goes up the ladder in the dark because she doesn't need light for this. Her hands and feet know the shape of it completely. The sleeping space is cold in comparison to the room she's left, and she moves into the blankets quickly, fitting herself around Thomas, who is already there, and within the pile of wool and warmth and quiet, she reaches the place that the whole long day has been moving toward. The sounds of the night outside, the wind if there's wind, an owl perhaps, the last distant sound of something on the lane, a neighbour's dog that barks once and falls silent, the sounds of the house, the settling of the beams, the small voice of the fire below cooling toward morning, the sounds of the family, Thomas breathing already in the even rhythm of someone who falls asleep quickly and sleeps well because he's used himself up in a good day's work, the children's breathing, audible, known, familiar as the house itself. She's warm, she's tired, the day is done. She'll wake once in the night, in the first waking of the old sleep pattern, and lie in the dark for a while, and think in that loose, unpressured way, and say what she means to whatever she prays to, and fall back into the second sleep. And in the morning she'll wake before the children, and go down the ladder, and put the bellows to the banked fire, and find the ember, and breathe it back to life. Because the fire is almost always still there if you've banked it right. Because one day follows another, and the year turns, and the cold passes, and the light comes back, and the seeds go in the tray on the windowsill, and the garden waits under the frozen soil for the exact right moment, the moment it always finds, when the earth begins to thaw, and the things that have been waiting since autumn push up, and the world turns again toward warmth. And it's enough, it's more than enough. It's a whole life, lived in a small stone cottage on a lane in Wiltshire, with a fire that breathes with you, and hands that know their work, and people who breathe in the dark around you, and the ember that's always almost certainly still there in the morning. That's where I want to leave you tonight, in the warmth of that thought, in the warmth of 5 people in a small space managing the winter together. Let the room go soft around you. Let the sounds of whatever night you're in settle into something familiar. The wind if there's wind, the quiet if there's quiet, the breathing of wherever you are. Sleep well, friend. Thank you for spending this evening at Sleepy Old World. I'll be here again next time, with another door into the past, another small warm world to step inside for a while. Until then, rest.